The iPhone has transformed the fate of mankind. Not only is the iPhone a mini computer that fits in the palm of your hand, but it is a culmination of decades of technology and innovation bundled into one small device. Today, after over 10 generations of evolution, the iPhone has become so prominent that there is about a 20% chance that you're watching this video right now with an iPhone. Apple has come to dominate the smartphone market, garnering so much control that they're basically able to set the prices for the whole market. They were able to connect mankind at a level never before seen and have revolutionized how people interact politically, economically, geographically, and socially. The iPhone and Apple can be tied back to one man's vision for the world, the one and only Steve Jobs. But what if Steve Jobs was never born? What if Apple was never created? What if their most successful product, the iPhone, never materialized? How would all of that transform our lives today? Many people assume that Apple invented the smartphone, but this is actually not true, and the smartphone dates back way before the iPhone was even conceptualized. The first true smartphone actually made its debut in 1992. It was a Simon personal communicator created by IBM. If you thought that the iPhone was expensive, IBM Simon actually ran you $900 in 1992, equating to over $1,400 in today's money. The Simon was far ahead of its time though. It had a monochrome LCD touchscreen measuring 4.5 inches by 1.4 inches. For a size reference, it's a little bit shorter in height and about half the width of an iPhone Plus device. Aside from calling, you could use the Simon to send and receive emails, take a look at the calendar, write notes, scroll through the world time, and even schedule appointments and download third-party apps. While the Simon would not receive widespread acclaim like the iPhone or Android phones, IBM did manage to sell about 50,000 units. So clearly, the concept of a smart device that could handle all of your daily needs had already not only been pondered about, but even put to practice before the iPhone. But this idea hadn't really caught on, and it wasn't very practical in use. For Simon, you had to use a stylus to navigate through the phone. Imagine having to text with a stylus. Seeing the 3 typing bubbles flashing for 10 seconds just to see the text OK would be the norm. Clearly, this simply wasn't going to work, and that's why smartphones really weren't very popular during the late 1990s and early 2000s. Instead, during this time there was a different market leader, BlackBerry. They had a strong hold on the phone market even a couple years after the launch of the iPhone. BlackBerry phones were as capable as iPhones. They had everything from calendars to music to internet access. They even had a physical keyboard and trackpad, which were much preferred over typing on glass one letter at a time. But what about the smartphone lineup? Well, around the same time Apple was developing the iPhone, Android was hard at work with their own operating system that could be widely used among smartphones. That's right, Google wasn't working on Android. Android was working on Android, as Android was actually an independent company established in 1998, and Google actually wouldn't buy Android till 2005 for $50 million. So Android 2 would have come out despite the iPhone not being released. And the first ever Android phone, T-Mobile G1, would have come out in October of 2008. So, if everything up until now would have unfolded the same way, what role did Apple play in the smartphone market? Well, Apple was always a premium brand name, from their MacBooks to their watches to their smartphones. Apple had the high quality premium devices, and this really drove a lot of attention to the smartphone market and really made smartphones much more desirable. Without Apple, the smartphone market wouldn't have grown as fast, as smartphones wouldn't have been as appealing. Innovation would have also stalled. While Apple's newer devices don't offer many new features, their original devices were brimming with innovation. From Siri to Touch ID to iMessage, the smartphone market as a whole would have moved forward at a much slower rate, allowing for a vast range of different possibilities. First of all, people wouldn't have flocked away from the BlackBerry nearly as quickly. In fact, they may have never left BlackBerry at all. If we are assuming the Android space develops in the same manner but slower, the conversion rate to Android would be much slower. It wasn't actually till the iPhone 6 that Apple really penetrated the market and made the iPhone a casual device across Western countries. Until then, BlackBerry was the clear choice as it was much cheaper and provided pretty much all the same functions that an iPhone offers. Without the iPhone, this breakthrough point for smartphones would have come much later, as in several years later, and BlackBerry would have kept their lead in the phone market, but eventually this change would still occur. So, At this point, who would play Apple's role as the premium device with the rivalry operating system? What about Samsung and LG, who control the largest portion of the smartphone market after Apple today? These companies really didn't start offering premium devices until a couple of years ago. The first really premium Samsung device was the Samsung Galaxy S6. Until then, the Galaxy series had plastic backs and Samsung wasn't competing with Apple head-on. They were trying to attract the utilitarian demographic who would buy the Samsung phones for the advantages that it provided, like expandable storage and highly customizable Android operating system. It wasn't until the Samsung Galaxy S6 that Samsung really started to compete in the smartphone market using brand and device image as opposed to the purpose that they fulfilled. So, if Apple wasn't there, here's the first theory on how things could have turned out. First of all, if the iPhone hadn't been released, Google may have never started licensing Android for other smartphone companies to use and kept Android to themselves. We may have seen the rise of Google phones as the super customizable phone that everyone wanted their hands on, and all the competitors would be on their own to develop their own operating system to go along with their own phones. But I don't think that this is a very likely outcome, as Google cares more about getting their name out with their products like Android, Gmail, and Google Drive than actually driving profit through these streams as well. Their main business model is built off of driving more traffic to Google.com. Considering this, Google would rather license out Android, offering it for a really cheap price to companies in order to really get their Android out there. They wouldn't profit much, if any, from the licensing of Android, but they would drive hundreds of millions of more people onto their main service, Google.com, from all the people who bought Android phones. So Google probably would have not licensed out Android. So, moving on to the second possibility, another tech giant may have branched out from Android and launched their own operating system. This could be anyone from smartphone giants like Samsung, LG, Motorola, and HTC. But as I discussed before, considering that these companies started with Android, there would be a lot of backlash if they suddenly switched to their own operating system. I think that such a phone would actually come from a company that doesn't have much of a presence in the smartphone market today, but does have vast resources to make such a product a reality, like Sony, Microsoft, or Dell. A startup company really wouldn't be able to do this, as it would be very difficult to create an operating system that a significant amount of people would prefer over Android from Google. Plus, such a feat would require much more capital than any venture capital firm would be willing to provide, so the chance of a startup like Banana or something taking over is quite slim. But there is a pretty good chance that one of the other technology giants would have done this. And that brings me into the third theory. What about the market leader at the time, BlackBerry? They had the resources and the audience to make such a transition into the smartphone market. Plus, considering that the smartphone market would be evolving at a much slower pace, this would give BlackBerry a lot more time to recognize this trend towards smartphones, and it would be much less likely they are just left in the dust like they are in our present timeline. Also, even to this day, BlackBerry uses their own operating system. So in this alternate timeline, BlackBerry would be in the perfect position to take over the smartphone market and launch a revolutionary device. Now, if they actually go through with this is a completely different argument, but they definitely would have the best chance of playing the role of Apple. Assuming that BlackBerry seizes this moment and builds a smartphone empire, what else would change? Well, if we take a look, the iPhone and the rise of the smartphone industry as a whole has also heavily impacted carriers. If you take a look at T-Mobile's stock prices, you can see a sharp decline after the launch of the iPhone and rise of smartphones. This was because the iPhone launched exclusively with AT&T, and the issue was that even after T-Mobile was supported at large by the smartphone market, T-Mobile just couldn't keep up with the constantly updating standards from 2G all the way to 4G and LTE. They simply didn't have the resources, or in this case, the towers to support all of this growth, and they too would be left in the dust just like BlackBerry is today. However, after the appointment of a new CEO, John Ledger, they would stage an epic comeback. But without such a fast-paced progression of smartphones in our alternate timeline, T-Mobile may have never lagged behind. Maybe they wouldn't be forced to offer dubiously cheap phone plans, and phone plan prices wouldn't be dragged down nearly as quickly as they have today. In our alternate timeline, smartphones as a whole would not be as common as they are among teens in middle school and high school as they are today. So what would happen to a lot of apps on the App Store? Surely revolutionary mobile games would no longer be revolutionary. Games like Clash of Clans and Clash Royale would not have nearly as big of a target audience. Would mobile games have even risen to become esport titles? And what about social media apps that kids nowadays are addicted to like Instagram and Snapchat? Would they even exist? Today, 90% of Snapchat users are from the age 13 to 24, so if smartphones hadn't really spread among kids, would apps like Snapchat, Vine, and TikTok even be created? This would have given social media giants so much more time to launch their own services. Maybe instead of Facebook having to buy Instagram and WhatsApp, they would have created the services on their own. Maybe Twitter would have launched Vine instead of having to buy them. And that's all just touching the surface of what could have happened without the iPhone. What about Amazon, Uber, and all of the other smartphone apps that we have grown accustomed to, and all the services that people use on a daily basis like Apple Pay? What about the jailbreaking community? There's no reason to jailbreak Android, so unless whoever comes to dominate the smartphone market doesn't allow for much customization, this community would never exist. Maybe people would be trying to jailbreak their Blackberries instead. Clearly, a world without the iPhone is almost like an alien civilization. No, just kidding, but there are so many distinct day-to-day differences that would arise from such a reality. And hey, there may be a lot of good things that arise from such a reality as well. Maybe in 2019, people wouldn't be as addicted to their smartphones. Maybe kids would engage in much more social activities. Maybe we'd all have more money if we weren't constantly buying newer iPhones for crazy high prices. And maybe we'd all be healthier. But those are all just possible outcomes if the iPhone was never invented. What about MacBooks, Apple Watches, and of course, what would we ever do without a $1,000 Apple monitor stand? Make sure to drop a like if you'd like to see videos on those as well. But I think we would all agree that the iPhone has touched all of our lives in one way or another. And I think that we'd all agree that the iPhone is one of the most revolutionary products of our generation. But that's all I have for you guys on the iPhone. Make sure to comment down below what you would like me to cover next. Also, if you guys like this video, then make sure to drop a like and consider subscribing if you'd like to see more videos just like this one. But until then, I'm Hari, and I'll see you guys on the next one.